Well, Shabbat Shalom again to everybody. So, we have, of course, another big portion this week, as they all are in Genesis. And so I mentioned it last week, but I realized as I was looking back through some old notes that this is the fourth year in a row that I am teaching this portion. So, which is interesting. I mean, I think but then last week, because I taught last week as well, I realized I apparently had never taught Noah before. So it's funny how that works out. But yes, this is my fourth year in a row teaching Lech Lecha, which starts in Genesis 12. So basically, Genesis 12 through 17 is what we're going to talk about this morning, or at least some of it. Who knows if we'll make it all the way through, because there's so much. But I've been, as I was kind of, I will admit, as I was kind of looking back through notes and reading some other things this week, I kind of have had a hard time figuring out exactly what it is I think we're supposed to talk about. So I kind of brought all the notes, and we'll see where we go. But one thing I was thinking about, a couple things I was thinking about, I hopefully we'll get to, but the first thing that was really coming to mind as we were reading this, and something we started to talk about a little bit last week, looking ahead, looking toward this portion, is just this idea, because we were talking last week about like what's God trying to tell us in the first 11 chapters that feel like so much history in so few pages in our Bibles, but it's so important. And one of the things we talked about was just this. I think one of the things that we're supposed to see in those 11 chapters is how quickly, or how much of a tendency there is for humanity. Let me make sure. Really, the kind of the how much the human heart is inclined toward evil, because even though it happens over quite a period of time, the way we read it, it's very quickly this descent into chaos, kind of, after the garden, right? To the point of there's so much evil, and we talked about how it's amazing. Like, how could the world be more evil then than it is now? I still don't have an answer for that one, but or maybe it's even not that it's not so evil. It's just that God promised He wouldn't wipe out humanity. I don't know, but because it does say, of course, we have later scriptures that say it will be like the days of Noah before Messiah returns, and so we know where we're heading, and it's making sense. But anyway, so I think one of the things I think the Lord is kind of, or God is kind of just letting us see this inclination of the human heart towards evil. And then we get to Abraham. We get to Genesis 12, and we get to this calling of Abraham. And it's really kind of this shift, or this pivot toward redemption. And the trajectory of the rest of the Bible, I would suggest the trajectory of the rest of the Bible is different from this point forward. So kind of want us to think, as we kind of look through some different sections of this portion, just think about that shift towards redemption and what we're seeing here, and even in comparison to some of the stories, and even some of the failings of humanity that we see in the first couple portions, and how we start to see some redemption and some shifting from those things going forward.
So are you saying kind of like, this is who you all are, this is how I want you to be, like the rest of the Bible?
Yeah.
I mean, rest of the narrative.
Yeah, I think, yeah, in some sense, yeah.
Come to me, have a relationship with me,
right.
This is how it'll work out.
Right.
For you all.
Yeah, I think so. Because I think we start to see, so it's interesting the way that we have, that God is presented even in His interaction with humanity, like after the garden. Like, of course, he interacts in the situation with Cain and Abel. He's interacting with Noah. He's interacting with at the Tower of Babel. But it doesn't feel as much as though he's consistently involved. Though we know he must be because we have even just little things like Enoch who continuously walked with the Lord. And we don't know what that means. But it talks about Noah walking with the Lord. So it seems like there is some relational aspect. We just don't have a lot of information about what that is. But it does seem to shift more personal and more, it just seems to be different from this point forward. So yeah, I think that's a good thing, to point out. Yeah.
Just a history question.
Sure.
At what point did all these writings get put together in one volume and get called the Bible?
Do you mean like the whole thing that we have now, or are you talking like the books of Moses or the Old Testament or
the whole thing?
The whole thing.
All the New Testament books.
So the whole thing, New Testament included, the canon was finalized roughly, which I'll explain in a second what I mean by finalized, because this is an important conversation also. But solidly what we have today, somewhere in the church councils around probably the 4th century. But what I mean by finalized is it was really just it was kind of when they met, I believe it was 4th century. It may have been a little earlier than that, but probably 4th, because our earliest manuscripts of most things are 2nd century. As far as New Testament, Old Testament, it's kind of a little bit of a bigger question. But as far as like the whole Bible, 4th century is probably when it was kind of agreed upon. And what that means, what finalized means, is it's not like that what happened was not that a group of men sat down and said, these are all the ones we have, let's vote on which one's going to be included and which one's not. What happened is they got together and said, we are all using these books, so these are what's going to be the canon. It was what they were already using. So it was just a formality, kind of, to agree this is our canon. Now, you do have others, so like if you pick up a Catholic Bible, you're going to have a few extra books. If you pick up some different Orthodox Bibles, you'll have the same thing. So there were some groups of people that were using some other books, and those have continued to be included. It was actually something that was really interesting to me when I visited the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I think it was all along one wall. They have all these different versions from these different traditions and what books were included. It was really interesting to walk through and see all of that. But what we have here are what everybody was using. So based on the process and how these councils convened, was that they basically said, okay, we are all using these, so this is going to be our canon. And then there were other groups of people that said, but we think this is authoritative, or at least helpful. So like we have, like in Jewish tradition, we have the Apocrypha, and we have some extra biblical sources that we wouldn't consider scripture, but they're very helpful for helping us understand Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy and Jewish tradition. So we can learn a lot from them, but they are not considered on the same level as scripture. So that being said, long before that, well before the time of Yeshua, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, had been agreed upon. And I don't remember the timing of all of that. It kind of is a little bit like how it's a little bit harder to track. And but the Tanakh, the Old Testament that we have, we know is what they would have been using at the time of Yeshua, and that would have been well established before then.
So the existence or the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the significance of that was not so much that it was new material, but that it was actual physical, contemporary, the only still existing. Okay.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were important for a couple of reasons. One, because it was good confirmation of the accuracy of the Tanakh that we had, particularly because they were Hebrew written, and it lined up pretty much exactly with what we had. So it was good confirmation that what we had was accurate. And as far as some of the other scrolls, because they found scrolls for every book of the Tanakh except for Esther, in the caves, and then they also had some other scrolls, some that were about kind of the practical, I guess, applications, that were documenting history, documenting practices, documenting traditions, things like that, that gave us a lot of other background to life at the time and Jewish thought at the time. So yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls was a really significant find for those reasons, and many others. And of course, we're still learning all kinds of things from those scrolls, which is really fun. So, all that to say, I'll just say this on that because I think the canonization of the Bible is actually really fascinating. I like to every once in a while I like to read or watch something. I watched a documentary about it several years ago that was just fascinating. And really, people like to talk about as an argument against the Bible about how many errors there are, which is kind of ridiculous. I'm not going to be able to remember all the statistics and exactly how he worded it because it's been a few years since I listened to it, but I listened to a scholar talk about this, and it's like, so when you count errors, they're counting things as like different spellings of names or different order of a word here and there, where this word order was reversed or things like that. So most of those are immaterial, right? Like this, a different spelling of Miriam, that's not actually an error, right?
Right.
It's an ancient typo, or it's a, whatever. But even the things that seem to change the meaning, there's very few. Like less than 10, I think, which is unreal for a text this old. And considering, and we have copies that are much closer to the time of when they would have actually been written than any other ancient text on the planet, and we have more of them. And so, like the number of like I can't, like I said, I can't remember the stats, but it's like crazy. Like if you hear how many different copies they have from throughout history, like it is incredible. Which tells us, one, that people found a lot of significance in preserving this text, right? So it's a really fascinating thing. And all that to say, like the Bible that we have, that we read, is far more accurate than any other ancient text you will ever study. So all this stuff that you hear, chatter that you hear about how there's all these inaccuracies and errors and things like that is kind of ridiculous. Anyway, it's a really fascinating thing to study. And the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C. does a really good job of showing actually that canonization process and some of the different examples of some of the different manuscripts that we have throughout history, and talking about the process of translation and retranslation, and as we find, that's one of the things that happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls, is it did give us a more accurate translation, because most translations were done from the Greek text at the time, from the Septuagint, because that was the more popular version in the first, second century, and then we had the Masoretic text, and we got to go back more to some Hebrew texts that helped us with accuracy, which is really interesting. So anyway,
how long ago did they start discovering them?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, 1948, right at the time when Israel, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. So, yep. 47 actually, I think, is when they found the first cave. But anyway, all right. So Abraham, here we go. Sorry, you hit one of my Bible nerd things. This is one of the things I really like, so that was fun. Okay, but Abraham. So something I was thinking about, and something that was sticking out, I was thinking about it before I went back through my notes, and I think I mentioned it a little bit last week, is that I read a book a few years ago. Part of it was assigned for a class, and then I just really enjoyed it, so I read most of the book. But it was a book by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who passed away in 2020, but he's written a lot about, he's an Orthodox Jew. He was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom He's just a fascinating person. But he wrote a book called To Heal a Fractured World, and he uses a lot of these early stories to demonstrate things that are still important in Jewish thought and Jewish tradition. And I don't really like how he talks about Noah, but I love how he deals with Abraham, how he talks about Abraham. And some of what he talks about with Abraham is actually with next week's portion. But one of the things that he points out about this beginning of the Abraham narrative talks about this need for what he calls like a need for responsibility, because he kind of sets up this framework of the first 11 chapters using 4 of the main narratives of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, and the Tower of Babel as these 4 examples of like basically humanity failing to take responsibility in different ways. So, and I've taught through that in more detail in the past. I won't go into all the detail, but basically he's pointing out these different moral failings on some level, or different types of failing of taking responsibility for action. Adam and Eve, it's this, it wasn't my fault, it was, Adam's blaming the woman and one woman's blaming the serpent. It wasn't this, it's this failure to take personal responsibility, and so on. So it's just these different examples of that. So Rabbi Sachs argues that Abraham is the reversal of all of those moral failings, or all of those failings to take responsibility. So, and he suggests that with Abraham, that we're getting an introduction to, after seeing all of these evil inclinations and kind of failings in the previous chapters, that what we're getting with Abraham is an introduction to the need for responsibility to accompany our freedom, meaning like our freedom of will and our just freedom to make choice, right? Which is something that Dennis Prager also talks about a lot, is that we actually, like, just left to our own devices, we're going to screw up real fast. We're going to go towards evil real fast. I think we've seen that. So we actually have to have responsibility, which is where Dennis Prager draws a distinction between freedom and liberty. He says, like, we actually need liberty, but which has rules, but allows for freedom of choice in some sense, but it still has consequence for action and things like that. So I'm just going to read this quote from this book, and then we can kind of actually jump into the portion, I promise. But he's talking about responsibility, how Abraham is showing this need for responsibility, and he says, the journey of responsibility is long, and there are many temptations to stop short of the final destination. But in the end, there is no real alternative if we are to live our full humanity. Adam loses paradise, Cain is condemned to wander, Noah declines into drunkenness. I sort of have an issue with it, if you don't know, but whatever. Babel is left unbuilt. Responsibility is the condition of our freedom, and we cannot abdicate it without losing much else besides. So if Abraham is the culmination, what more is there to say? The answer is that humanity is not comprised of individuals alone. We cannot live alone, nor can we create alone. We are social animals, and that is why God's covenant with Abraham must be succeeded by another and more extensive order. Only a nation can build a society, and only a society can bring the divine presence into the public square, its economy and politics, its shared life and collective history. So there's this idea that the first section of Genesis is about individuals, and now Abraham, still about an individual, but we start to, but what is the covenant with Abraham about? Land, seed, and blessing. So it's unto this chosen people, this priestly reality, the kings that will come. We see all of this mentioned in this covenant making, and I think I didn't write it down, but I think Rabbi Sachs has even something about, like, by the time we get to the end of Genesis, we have a people group, really. So we see, but this is where we see the turning point to where we're developing that people group. So I thought that was really interesting, both the idea that taking responsibility, which we'll talk about what some of that looks like as we jump into the portion, and also just the fact that we have, like, that that we can't do it alone. Like that we have to do it in community. We have to do it in family. We have to do it as a group of people, because that's the only way to bring actual change. So with that, let's jump into the actual portion. So starting in Genesis 12, I think I'll just kind of jump through, and if people have comments and things like that, we can talk about it, and hopefully we'll kind of make it through the whole portion by kind of just looking at some different sections. So, but we'll start with Genesis 12, 1, which is this initial calling. Then Adonai said to Abram, "Get going out from your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land I will show you. My heart's desire is to make you into a great nation, to bless you, to make your name great so that you may be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but whoever curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." So Abraham goes, he goes into the land of Canaan, and he goes up on this mountain. He builds an altar, and then he continues his journey, ultimately going to Egypt because of a famine. And of course, then we have this whole interesting exchange about Abraham and Sarah with his, and lying to say that she's his sister, and this whole thing with Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh basically kicking him out, being like, how, like, because you deceived me, so you could go on and take your stuff. And then they go back, and they start journeying back towards the land once again. So, with this initial calling of Abraham, which is interesting, right? This is something that always is interesting to look at, is the association and the relationship with the land. Because so it's interesting, so Abraham's called, and he goes into the land and then leaves. He goes and sees it, so there's his famine, so he leaves. And it's like, why would you not just stay where you're supposed to stay? And we see this wrestle with all the patriarchs. It's like whether they're supposed to be in the land or not. But anyway, any initial comments about this calling of Abraham section?
Well, the fact that, and I don't think we've seen this verbiage before, where the Lord actually tells somebody, you know, this is my heart's desire, is to do this. He's laying out his plan to this man. I mean, you don't really see him do that type of thing again until Moses, where he's sharing on that kind of an extent. But again, yeah, the renewing of the covenant, seed, land, blessings. But just to me, the fact that, you know, he's basically laying it out to Abram at this time. This is my heart's desire. This is now what I want to do. Where it doesn't mean that wasn't his heart's desire from the beginning, except in the beginning, he just wanted to dwell with man. Now we're at this point where, how do we get back to this garden? This is my heart's desire, to get you guys back into a nation, you know, turn you into a nation, a people group that could dwell with, type of thing. And so I find that amazing, and I also find the fact that he's back in with the blessing and curses in this too. He's still a Lord that I'm going to bless, and those who come against my seed will be cursed, the same way the serpent was cursed. There's it hyperlinks all the way back to that on the blessing and curses of that again.
Right. Yeah, which is one of the things. This is where we start to see. So Adam and Eve, of course, sin and are cast out of essentially the land that God had created for them, and now we see Abraham being called back, and he's obedient to go. But it's also this reaffirmation, because right, this is the initial instruction given to Adam and Eve is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so really we're seeing a version of that here, right? It's like but it's contrasted with the fact that Abraham is already old and doesn't have any children, and doesn't seem like he's going to have any children. So it's kind of this reversal of circumstances of the garden in that response, and Abraham is obedient. And there's been a lot. I've read. It's really interesting to read just some of the different theories of why Abraham, and really no one knows. We don't know, why Abraham out of everybody. It seems a random choice. Of course, nothing with God is actually random, but there's nothing particular about Abraham that suggests that why he's the person chosen. So it's interesting, but he is obedient, and so therefore can continue to carry this covenantal blessing, which is interesting. So they continue moving on. They go up from Egypt and they come up into the Negev. We learn that Abraham has, and I know his name is Abram at this point. It feels difficult to switch back and forth between Abram and Abraham. So I'm just using Abraham just to use one name. I know God changes his name. This is actually the text that people should use when people's name. People like to use talking about Paul, but Paul's name actually didn't get changed. That's a thorn in my side about that one. People like to use Paul. He was Saul, and then God changed his name. No, he didn't. He had two names. Okay. Anyway, we don't need to go there. That's a rabbit I don't need to chase. Anyway, but Abraham's name does actually get changed. I'm just using the name Abraham because I am. Anyway, so they come back up. We find out that he is quite wealthy, it seems. And he returns to where he's made this altar, but Lot is with him. So this interaction with Lot is really interesting, which of course we come back to Lot in next week's portion, and it continues to be an interesting dynamic and a lot of interesting things to look at with that. But this relationship with Lot is really interesting. So it seems their families are traveling together. Both quite wealthy, and we get basically this story of separating land because they can't, if they all dwell together, it's too much for the land to support. So Abraham gives Lot first choice, and Abraham basically what happens is Lot chooses the developed cities to live in, which is interesting. I'm trying to remember exactly what it is I was reading through, and it was really interesting, but Prager says something interesting about this when you urbanize that things don't go well for you. Interesting. So it's interesting that Lot made that choice. But anyway. You're around too many people. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But ultimately, it even says from here in chapter 13, verse 12 and 13, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the valley, and he moved his tent from place to place near Sodom. But the people of Sodom were evil, very great sinners against Adonai. So Lot has kind of chosen to dwell among, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, we don't know, among these people who the Bible is calling evil. And we know that evil tends to spread.
Don't you find it kind of interesting that the land is, and when he picks this land, he says it's like Adonai's garden.
Mm-hmm.
Then he says, like the land of Egypt, yet it's a city.
Yeah.
So it's like, so that whole comparison thing of saying that it's, because we really don't see that phrase like Adonai's garden very often in there.
Right.
So.
And then to connect it with Egypt as well.
To connect it with Egypt.
Yeah.
It just seems very like a strange combination of Adonai's garden, Egypt, and a city.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, this is interesting. I think it's interesting because because what they're explaining is Lot's perspective, right?
Yeah.
So, to me, what that suggests is that Lot's perspective is a bit skewed. His understanding of what the Lord created in the garden, his understanding of what is what it means to be good land is different than reality. And Abraham is seeing something different. I mean, even though he's giving Lot the choice, Abraham is really getting what God would call good, I think.
Maybe they had a great civic park system.
Maybe.
It's kind of like when you talk to different people about their vision of the garden or vision of heaven or vision, what somebody's mind concept of this is what would be heaven to me or this is what the garden would be. It kind of shows like different perspectives of what somebody would envision that would look like. And obviously Sodom and Gomorrah is what Lot envisions that God's
So interesting.
garden would look like.
Yeah. So interesting. And I wonder if it goes back to this. We've talked about in the past, like this idea of this desire for power and this desire for authority. And in a city is where you would achieve that. So I don't know, maybe there's something to, again, it doesn't say, so this is all us imagining a little bit, but maybe there's something to Lot wanting to be in the, if he's wealthy, maybe he thinks I can go in, he can have all this power and all this authority and all this recognition, which we've talked about before, that a lot of times we're humanity or people are often willing to sacrifice a lot for that recognition and authority. So maybe some of that is at play here too. And that's what's so desirable to him, that he's projecting that onto his understanding of the Lord, which is a little bit scary. But, yeah, it's interesting. One thing I thought was interesting that I don't know that I had really noticed, or at least it hadn't really stuck out to me until I was reading it. I was reading back through this even last night and this morning. That at the end of chapter 13, so Lot goes in and dwells in the cities and in Sodom and Gomorrah. And Adonai says to Abram, this is chapter 13, verse 14, lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are to the north, south, east, and west. For all the land that you are looking at, I will give to you and to your seed forever. I will make this seed like the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, then your seed could also be counted. Get up, walk about the land through its length and width, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent from place to place and came and dwelt by Mamre's large trees, which are in Hebron, and there built an altar to Adonai. So a couple things that stuck out to me in that section that seemed significant were, one, the seed like the dust of the earth, which most often I feel like when we talk about Abraham, we talk about God saying that I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars, which is a nicer picture, right? Mm-hmm. It's more pleasant to think about the stars than about dust. But what does dust make you think of? Looking backward, the forming of Adam. He's like, people are made from dust. We come from dust. So I thought that was really interesting. An interesting connection back to that, particularly talking about in connection with just like he's seeing the land that they're going to live in, and just this connection that we come from the land in some sense if we think back to the creation narratives. And then also, this is the part that really stuck out to me that I hadn't really thought about. I just had kind of read past it and was like, okay. But he moved his tent from place to place. So he's moving all around this land. I don't know that I had really thought about that before. maybe it's just me, and maybe I'm being a little bit silly about it. But it's like, I hadn't really thought about the fact that he's moving and dwelling in the whole land before he settles. I had just kind of been like, okay, well, he's traveling, so he can't kind of camps along the way. But it's like, no, but God instructed him to move about the whole land. So really, I mean, it's almost this like, I don't know, for some reason it was making me think, and this is sort of a half-baked thought, so this maybe will fall apart really fast, but it kind of was making me think ahead towards like the wilderness of them moving from place to place at the command of the Lord. I mean, this doesn't talk about a pillar of cloud that he's following, but he was instructed to go to all these to go around the land. So it's like almost this interesting of like moving about of this people group, which we're about to find out is actually a fairly significant number of people. And before coming to like the final dwelling place where he builds this altar to worship the Lord.
I don't remember where it was that I read it, and it was years ago. It said that it was a way that people marked their property was to move all around it. So couldn't that be a claim to the land even before? So that would kind of justify Israel's claim while our patriarch marked his territory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely seems to be going into this. I just don't know that I had thought about it, about him going around the whole land. I was just like, oh, he's on his way. So he like pitches his tent on his way, but it's like it seems as though he goes around. So yeah, I think it very much is this whole like walk the property. You walk your lines, your borders, and there's something going on. Of course, again, we don't have all the details of what that means, and what he actually did. But it does seem like he did go through the whole land and get to see it and get to kind of make a claim on it. So that seemed significant to me as I was reading through. And like I said, I think I've just kind of like read through that and kind of just kept going before. And I was like, wait a minute, this is significant. Like you're saying, this is a marking of territory. This is like laying claim.
Was that a way that they did it back then?
Yeah.
It actually was wherever your foot fell and you could mark it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was probably a little bit more to it than that. At this point, they're obviously not overtaking, they're not overthrowing the peoples that live there. But there is something. But then it goes on to talk about, and this is like in chapter 14. There's all these things. There's basically kind of giving this account. There's all this stuff going on in the land between these different groups of people that are already there. So apparently Israel has always been there's been some warfare going on. Go figure. Anyway, but we find out that, where is it?
On the dust comment you made, and that takes us back to Genesis, but it also takes us forward to when Balaam was asked to curse Israel, and one of those times he said, "Who can count Jacob's dust?" I mean, there was like that.
I forgot about that.
Bringing that forward in that too, so that phrasing, even out of Balaam, on who can count it, and then I'll make your seed like the dust. So again, we've got this moving forward. We see it re-emphasized again as they're getting ready to go in and take that land.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And there's no way Balaam would have known.
Right.
This is the.
Right.
Right. So
right.
I think that's kind of, since you brought up the dust,
No,
I think that's kind of cool that that thread keeps getting pulled through this.
Yeah. And there's some other passages that isn't it in the Psalm somewhere that it's like we remember that we are dust or something like that. And so there's different things, but it was just so it's another one of those threads I haven't followed all the way through quite so intentionally before. So I thought that's really interesting. That's really good though. So moving into chapter 14, as we kind of see all these different things going on in the land, and we see Lot has some trouble, right? Things are not going well for Lot in his choice of dwelling among Sodom and Gomorrah. So all this is happening to Lot. Everything's getting stolen from him. Things are not going well. And somebody comes and it says, so chapter 14:13, a survivor came and told Abram the Hebrew. This is the first time that he's called a Hebrew, which is interesting. who was dwelling by the large trees belonging to Mamre the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and the brother of Anar. They were Abram's allies. So he has some favor with some of the people in the land, at least, which is interesting. But when Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he rallied his trained men, those born in his household, 318 of them. So this is a large family. Even though he doesn't have any children, this is still a large family.
Does he actually not have any children whatsoever? He doesn't have any concubines or...
Not that we know of at this point. I mean, it's difficult to say, but it doesn't seem like he has any, because it says...
Because when he sends away Ishmael and the others...
Yeah, again, it's interesting. Yeah, we don't know exactly who this is. It seems like Abraham doesn't have any children, because it seems like the whole episode with Hagar and Sarah and all of that is a new situation. But
He continues to tell God, I don't have any children.
right,
So
so
that would be kind of a strange statement.
it
if
would-
he's counting them as his heirs or
Right.
his children.
particularly considering in ancient culture, like if he did have children by slaves and concubines, they are his children, or their children. It would even be considered Sarah's child, which is what the whole issue is with Hagar. But
The next chapter, he says, I am living without children.
mhm. So I think all of these people are probably. I think it's probably extended family. Is more of what I understand. Or just people living alongside him, because it says his trained men, those born in his household, 318 of them. So yeah, we don't get a lot of definition of what that means, but it seems like maybe it's extended family, and then any slaves and things like that would be with them. But still, it's a larger group of people than I picture until I read that. I'm like, oh, there's a lot of people. Okay. And those are just the ones that go out. So presumably some people are staying behind. So there's probably more than that. So anyway, so they go out and they go and defeat. They go defeat these people. He brought back all his possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot and his possessions, as well as the women and the other people. So he goes and he has this great rescue, which this is a little bit of a reversal of the Cain and Abel story. Because really, he's taking, again, we've kind of framed this in this issue of responsibility, that Abram kind of sees himself as responsible for Lot, so he's going out to rescue his family member, whereas Cain, which is a different situation, whereas Cain kills Abel and doesn't want to take responsibility for the blood on his hands, Abram is like, I don't want my family member's blood on my hands, and so he goes and saves them. So again, we continue to see this this love for his family that we didn't see before. Even though it doesn't seem like Lot was making good choices at the time. I guess I'll stop there. Any comments or questions or thoughts on that before we continue on to Melchizedek?
When I read this story this week, I couldn't but not think about what's going on with Israel now, with
Yeah.
people being taken captive. And
Yeah.
it just kind of reminded me that the word gives us kind of a playbook for how the Lord handles things.
Mm-hmm.
And Abram responded and dealt quickly
Yeah.
with what happened.
Right.
People were taken captive, and he was speaking with the Lord at this time, and so and I'm trusting. I think we all are trusting and praying that what's going on is in the Lord's timing, and His timing is perfect. But the Lord is a God of swift justice, and He
Yeah.
does things when the
Mhm.
wrong is made, He goes and handles it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So I just think it quickly came up to my mind when I was reading it. I just could not make the
Yeah.
connection between the two.
That's really good. Yeah, it's actually one of the things I was thinking about reading this portion this week. I think was one of the things that was so difficult to figure out, what exactly are we supposed to talk about, is because there were several things as I was reading through this that it's like, this is kind of, it feels very much like this is almost start of the dynamic that we're seeing play out right now, thousands of years later, which is difficult. And at the same time, I like what you're saying, the encouragement of like the Lord does bring judgment. The Lord does bring, he does rescue, he does, you know, he's gotten lots of people out of lots of really difficult situations if they turn and call on him. Because the key to what you said, right, is that Abraham and God, they're talking. There's a relational connection here with the Lord. So it's something we need, as you know, there's many things to pray about, of course, right now, with what's going on in the land and with the people. But one of them, I think, needs to be that there would be hearts turning to the Lord, and they would be crying out for his justice and his battle plan, I guess, so to speak. Because it does seem, it's like one of the things that's one of the themes I've been hearing as I've talked to people and listened to some different things this last week, is just this sense that the Lord is really he's really after people's hearts right now. Yes, we want the lives of the hostages to be spared. We want the lives of the innocent people in Gaza to be spared. We want life spared, but God is really after hearts right now. So I think that's something that we can pray into. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over Melchizedek a little bit, which is really hard. I know, I'm sorry.
That's okay, because you could spend 2 hours.
I know, it's fascinating. This how many verses is this even? 7 verses? Is like mind-blowing, honestly. Read that and enjoy it for yourself. But I want to continue on this covenantal path with Abraham a little bit. So I'm sorry. I'm going to skip Melchizedek. I love Melchizedek. I love this little section. But we're going to keep going. Okay, so after all this happens with Lot, after this interesting meeting with this mysterious priestly king of Jerusalem, aka Yeshua, probably, we have the Lord coming and really actually cutting and establishing the covenant with Abraham at this point. And this is where we start to see things coming in like visions and dreams and some of these really significant encounters, which is kind of fun. So chapter 15 begins with, after these things, the word of Adonai came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." And this is what Hillary was referring to. He says, "I'm living without children. The heir of my household is Eliezer of Damascus." And so he's which is a good lesson. It's like, it's okay to bring before the Lord, if the Lord gives you this vision or this promise, and be like, "Hey, look, this is not working out. I don't see it. How are you going to do this, Lord?" But God then gets more specific in his promise. The one who will come from your own body will be your heir. And he took him outside. And this is this famous passage. You look up now at the sky and count the stars if you're able to count them. So shall be your seed. So shall your seed be. Whatever. And he believes the Lord about that, which is important. That he chooses to believe. And they continue this promise. So then we have this actual cutting of the covenant scene. The Lord instructs him to bring these animals and cut them in half, which this is an ancient covenant making practice. So this would be traditionally carried out between two groups of people, and they would cut the animals, and both people making the covenant would walk between them, basically saying that if we don't keep our end of the deal, we become like these animals, meaning you die. But in this case, so this is an example of the Lord taking a common practice at the time and shifting it a little bit. So they came because they kind of he sets this up, right? He cuts the bird or cuts the animals, not the birds. And so when the sun was about to set, then Abraham goes to sleep. I always think it's really interesting. I'm like, I don't know why this fascinates me so much that I'm like that the Lord makes this covenant with Abraham while he's asleep. I'm like, was he going to screw it up if he was awake or something? Like, I don't know. I just think it's really interesting that this all happens while he's asleep. So, so the Lord comes and we have this whole thing that your seed will be strangers in the land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I'm going to judge the nation that they will serve. Afterward, they will go out with many possessions. And of course, we see this. We know that this does happen with the Exodus. So this whole thing plays out. We cut the covenant. He gives the kind of the parameters of the land that's being given. So we have this covenant, but we still have the problem that Abraham doesn't have any children. And this is one of the sections that I was thinking about this week in relation to the world that we currently live in, because this is really the start of this dispute. Is that Abram knows he's supposed to have a child of his own, so he kind of makes it happen, right? Or he and Sarah kind of make it happen. So of course we have Ishmael being born. We have some tension between between Sarah and Hagar. Sarah sends her away, and the angel comes, and this is really interesting. This is one of the things I've been trying to process with the Lord, and I haven't reached any conclusions. Maybe you guys can help me. They send Hagar away, and the Lord visits her as she's kind of out in the wilderness. So the angel of the Lord comes to her. This is chapter 16, verse 7 and 8. Starting verse 8, he said, the Lord said to Hagar, Sarah's slave girl, which is interesting that that's how the Lord identifies her. Mm-hmm. Where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of Adonai said, return to your mistress and humble yourself under her hand. Then the angel of Adonai said to her, I will bountifully multiply your seed, and they will be too many to count. Then the angel of Adonai said to her, behold, you are pregnant and about to bear a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for Adonai has heard your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And away from all his brothers will he dwell. So she called Adonai, who was speaking to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, where would I have gone here, indeed looking for him who looks after me? That is why the well is named the well of the living one who sees me. And then, of course, Ishmael is born when Abram is 86 years old. So, what do we think about this?
I was about to ask you, what's your conflict?
My conflict is that this is like I said before, this is the beginning of the conflict we're still in the middle of, because Ishmael is all of the Arab people ultimately descend from Ishmael, and so it's interesting that the Lord says, and this is where there's a gap between what the Lord says and knows and our understanding of it, because he's basically prophesying over Ishmael that everyone's going to be against him. Everyone's hand against him, and he's going to dwell away from his brothers. And so it's like, okay, Lord, what are you doing? But he's very much, I think, my understanding of the Lord's heart is I don't think that's the same as the Lord saying that he's not supposed to be submitted to the God of Israel. I mean, I think, and this is what we're seeing, lots of half-baked thoughts here, so to hold what I say very loosely. But this is what's so interesting is because I think that even with this prophecy, I don't think it's meant that he is supposed to live away from the presence of the Lord, even though we see conflict prophesied in the family. And even in the very next chapter, he's circumcised on the same day as Abraham. So he's a part of the covenant, right? So there's supposed to be, I think, there's supposed to be some level of relationship. There's still supposed to, like, the desire, I think, is that Ishmael and his descendants would still call on the God of Israel, even though there seems that there's going to be some conflict and animosity between them. And I don't know how this works. Like, I don't know how this works in God's kingdom. And I don't fully know what he intended. But it's interesting reading this in light of what's going on and watching some of the responses that have come up. I'm sure some of you, hopefully all of you, have heard of particularly on college campuses, the rallies that have been happening in support of Hamas, like directly in support of Hamas, which is wild to me, and calling for Jewish people to be killed. I keep seeing posts of signs and quotes of things being said, being like, "This is not World War II. This was yesterday," and it's terrifying. But anyway, so to see there's this brother against brother that the Lord says is going to happen, and yet he desires for all people to call on his name, right? And this is one of the things I keep thinking of, like what I'm seeing playing out with people taking sides and different rallies that are happening and all the terrible things that we're seeing. And back in September, the Tikkun Global Conference happened in Texas, and one of the sessions, Asher did a panel with Arab Christian believers who love Israel, which in many people's brains is like, it's not a thing. And it was really interesting. If you haven't seen it, I would really encourage you to go find it. If you just go to Tikkun Global on YouTube, there's like a whole playlist of everything from the Tikkun Global Conference, and you'll find, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like, you'll be able to find it really easily in that playlist of basically like Asher, like a panel of Arab Christians. And so it's like, so there's a lot of movement towards this reconciliation, and at the same time, there's this great conflict. So reading this portion this week, I think, was really challenging me a little bit of like, okay, Lord, I don't know how to understand this. I don't know how to understand what he's saying over Ishmael in contrast to what I know of his heart and what's playing out in the world. It's all very complicated. So, again, something I don't have conclusions for, but just reading through it and seeing this prophesied conflict is something I've really been thinking about. And yet, I do wholeheartedly believe that God desires for all to call on his name, and to live as a family of God. So, I don't have any answers for how that works right now.
I think that's key that you point that out, and that then he was circumcised with Abraham.
Yeah.
And so yes.
Yeah.
That's God's intention.
Yeah, and I think we have a tendency to dismiss, because it makes it a little bit easier in our brains if we can just dismiss Ishmael and say, well, it was just he's always, these are the people who are always going to be against the descendants of Isaac, against the Jewish people. So it's easier to just dismiss it, but that's not what's happening here. God does not dismiss him. And so we are left with this great tension and this great wrestle that has lasted for however many thousand years it's been, depending on which timeline you want to follow.
Well, and yeah, we also see with Ishmael, the first time when Hagar ran away, and the Lord tells her to go back so that Ishmael would be born in Abraham's house,
right?
And circumcised
Right.
and raised there. And then the second time when they're actually cast out, the Lord didn't allow Ishmael to die
Right.
in the wilderness. I mean, at that point in time, he gives her the decree that he'll be a great nation.
Right.
So obviously, twice going out into the wilderness or being sent off, Ishmael could have died. I mean,
Yeah.
this whole thing could have died right there. But it shows also, okay, maybe it's not going through the sea, but he is a nation. So it shows the Lord's heart for the seed and for the nations.
Yeah.
Because it would be a great nation. Yeah, there's going to be problems, there's going to be family issues, but it was never the Lord's desire for Ishmael to die, obviously.
Right. Right.
And letting his mom know that twice, I'm going to take care of your kid.
Right.
That is huge in the playing out of this. So we do have, to the Jew first,
Yes.
the promise is given to the seed, but the Lord cared for and desired to care for the nations too. And learning that to come together in all of this, I mean, that conflict unfortunately is there, and it was prophesied that it would be there, but that doesn't mean that you two have to be mortal enemies.
Right. Right. Yeah, and we see some of that play out as we continue the story of different. I mean, ultimately, things do descend into the point of being kind of mortal enemies. But there are times when they are friendly. They're very separate, but they exist together on some level, at least portions of them. And so, but you're right. It's like God is protecting and defending Ishmael's life and inclusion as part of Abraham's family, because there's these two very significant moments when the first time when she's pregnant, when she goes out in the wilderness, and God tells her to go back so that Ishmael is born in the household of Abraham. She could have just kept going, maybe been taken in by one of these other people groups that's in the land at the time. More likely that she would have died in the wilderness, but she could have been taken in. Somebody could have had mercy on her and been taken in. We would have never known what came of him. But God intentionally sends her back so that he's born in his household. And then again, like you're saying, and she's sent out when she goes out in the wilderness after he's born. There's this promise and blessing of multiplication on both Ishmael and Isaac from the Lord. So we can't dismiss that. We can't dismiss the descendants of Ishmael as much as that would make it simpler in our minds. So there's a nice complicated wrestle for you to take away.
God obviously loved Hagar.
Yeah.
And he obviously loved Ishmael.
And she felt his love, right?
Yeah.
You are the God who sees me, right?
Yeah.
And so she even encounters the Lord. And so, yeah, I don't know. And it's like I said, given our modern context, I'm not sure. It's very difficult to figure out how to navigate all of that. But I think I've said this enough times. You guys are kind of with me. I think is that we can't give up on Ishmael. We can't give up on the descendants of Ishmael, and which is what I love about this. Has been something that Asher has been focusing on for the last several years. His work that he's been doing with David Damien and some different things, and just so I would encourage you, if you haven't heard him Asher speak about this, to go find some of that and try to hear his heart on some of this. And that's why I've been trying to watch some of his videos even as the war's been going on, because he does have he's not afraid of tension and conflict. So he's willing to hold the tension of Israel needs to fight back hard, and yet we love these people. So if you haven't listened to that, or if it's somewhere in that wrestle, I would encourage you to spend some time on that and to not leave the tension, but to enter into it and process it with the Lord. It's difficult, but I think it's a part of the Lord's heart that we're supposed to try to access. So there's that. And we need to wrap up here, but one final comment here on chapter 17, just as our kind of closing little moment. So we talked about it a little bit already, but this is where we have this covenant of circumcision, which becomes the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, with Ishmael being and everyone being circumcised. While in the midst of this happening, God is still prophesying, no, Sarah is going to have a baby. When Ishmael is already 13 years old, is this being prophesied, which is really interesting. So by this point, Ishmael's aware. He's old enough to be aware of this family dynamic and what's going on.
I feel like this family dynamic really highlights just the brokenness that comes with not following God's plan
Right.
for family and for life. Like, God did not design a man to have more than one wife, and when you bring that into play,
Yeah.
things get really wacky.
It does.
And yet God's not going to take away our free will, so he just tries to work within the mess that
Right.
we create for ourselves. I think a lot of the dynamics we see here is the tension that came from
Yeah.
the brokenness of trying to do it a different way than the way God designed.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't work very well.
Right.
And so I'm sure that's why that's played into a lot of these dynamics we see with even the prophecy over Ishmael, that his hand will be against everyone. I mean, what kind of psychological issues did he have growing up knowing he was,
Right.
you know? I don't
Yeah.
know, just a lot going on there, even
Yeah.
just in a humanity
Right.
level
Right.
that
Right.
affects things. And I just think that highlights the brokenness that comes when we stray from, when we try to do it our own way, apart from God's way.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and we continue to see this play out, right? With there's always a problem when there's more than one wife, which is juxtaposed against the fact that polygamy is normative in the ancient world, and on some level necessary for the survival of humanity, because there are a lot more threats to your life. You know, lots more children dying in childbirth. I mean, you don't have modern medicine, you don't have a modern world, so people are dying quickly and younger, and or not surviving from childbirth. You know, like there's all these other things going on that on some level it's necessary for humanity to multiply. And so it's like, so we have the issue, but what we see, you're right, again, this narrative is like whenever they go against God's design for family, we have complicated problems that last for thousands of years, right? So let that be sobering to us. And yet we also see the mercy of the Lord, right? Like, and so it's like, because like, I'm sure we all know people who have really complicated families, or you're in a complicated family, you know, that things don't always go, even if you have the best of intentions to live what God's saying. The world is really messy. And so we all end up having complicated families, or parts of our families, or knowing, you know, we all end up with this, and yet we see the Lord's mercy and kindness in the midst of that. He is able to work within brokenness. But it is difficult. It doesn't take away the difficulty and the tension of it. So yeah, I think that's really good to see. And I think, you know, again, going back to like it's been so sobering to read this portion this week in light of, I'm like, this is the beginning of what we're now seeing. It's so interesting to me. I've been thinking it since the war started, as we were starting to read Genesis again. I was like, what is going on? Like, this is really interesting. This is really interesting timing. I don't really know fully what that means, but it's been something that has stuck out to me the whole time. And so I'm curious to see if it might be one of those things that makes more sense later. But it's been really interesting to see this play out while reading these portions. So, sorry I don't have any conclusions for you necessarily, other than my exhortation is really just to press into the Lord's heart in the midst of this tension, because he, like I said, like I take comfort in knowing that he's not afraid of messy, broken situations. I would like to try to make it all nice and neat and make it work and draw, solid boundary lines. Like this is the bad, this is the good, and have nice black and white situations. And that's not at all what we have.
Well, the fact that he sends Hagar back into
Yeah.
the messy situation.
Right. Right.
You go back and live in tension.
Right.
And in hardship.
Right. Yeah.
It's still the better option.
Yeah. And it forces us to rely on the Lord. It forces us to ask him what the way through is, because clearly if we try to figure it out on our own, we're going to miss something. But on maybe a slightly more encouraging note, let me end with this, because I thought this was really interesting this week when I read this. I'm mostly reading through the Bible this year using some sources with Jewish commentary, which the Lord was leading me to even before all this stuff started happening in Israel, which I thought was really interesting. But anyway, one of the commentaries I was reading, he points out, he makes a lot of comments about translation and translation choices and what the original Hebrew means and things like that, which is just really interesting to me. So in chapter 17, in verse 1, when it's saying that Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord appears to him and says, I am El Shaddai, which, side note, no one knows what that actually means, which is fascinating. But it says, continually walk before me, and you will be blameless, is how the TLV translates it. But what he said is where it says, continually walk before me, is the same in the Hebrew as walk in my presence, which is going back to, and I think if I don't have it completely written down in my notes, if I'm remembering correctly, it even goes back to the same, what God said, what it says about like Noah and Enoch, that they continually walk in the presence of the Lord. So it's this, so even though we have this wrestle of like, is God really there? Is he really not? We still have consistently people throughout history who are walking in the presence of the Lord. Even though we don't know what that means, we know that it is possible in all this brokenness and in all this chaos and evil for a person to walk continually in the presence of the Lord. So be encouraged that it's possible. And that he's willing, like I said, like I continue to return to the fact like he is willing to show up and be present in the midst of broken, messy humanity, and that doesn't ever change. And so if we can continue to remember that and continue to intentionally pursue his presence, we can also continually walk in the presence of the Lord. And so Lord, we thank you that you are present with us. We thank you that you want to be present with us. We thank you for these examples from the very beginning, that you want to be with your people, Lord. And Lord, we just ask, as Israel continues to be at war, Lord, we ask for your continued guidance on how to pray and how to partner with you in the midst of what's happening. We do ask that you would call your people to yourself, Lord, that people's hearts on both sides, on every side, throughout the world, Lord, that people's hearts would turn to you and partner with you, Lord, as we seek to see a resolution come in the end of the war, and the end of the loss of life, Lord. And we do ask for protection over innocent people, but we ask that evil be defeated.